All right, let's go. Number 8. Leon Degrelle. In 1940, as German forces rolled across Belgium in a matter of weeks, a magazine publisher from Bouillon made a calculation that would define the rest of his long, disgraceful life. His name was Leon Degrelle, founder of the Rexist Party, a Belgian fascist movement he had built through the 1930s on a platform of Catholic nationalism and authoritarian politics. He looked at the Nazi occupation of his country and saw not a catastrophe, but an opportunity. Degrelle had spent years cultivating a political movement that never broke through into real power. The Rexist Party peaked at around 12% of the Belgian vote in 1936 and had been declining ever since. When Germany conquered Belgium in May 1940, Degrelle didn't mourn. He volunteered for the Waffen-SS. What followed was, by any military measure, a genuinely impressive combat record. Degrelle rose through the ranks to command the 28th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division Wallonien on the Eastern Front, was wounded multiple times, and was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. Adolf Hitler allegedly declared that if he had a son, he would want him to be like Degrelle. Degrelle repeated this claim often in later life, which tells you a great deal about the man. The grandiose fantasy was that Degrelle would help forge a Burgundian state within the Nazi Empire, a reborn medieval kingdom carved from Belgium and northern France. The Germans entertained this delusion just long enough to get his soldiers killed on the Eastern Front. Nearly 30,000 Walloon volunteers served under his command or in associated units. A catastrophic proportion of them did not come home. As Allied forces closed in on Germany in 1945, Degrelle fled by aircraft to Norway and then crash-landed in Spain, where Francisco Franco refused to extradite him. Belgian courts sentenced him to death in absentia. He never served a single day in prison, gave interviews praising Hitler well into the 1980s, and died in Malaga in 1994 at the age of 87. Belgium sentenced him to death. Spain gave him a villa. He died in bed, the most comfortable traitor on this entire list, which tells you everything about the limits of justice. Number 7. John Amery. On November 19, 1945, a man stood in the dock at the Old Bailey in London and pleaded guilty to high treason. The judge confirmed he understood the charge. The entire proceeding lasted 8 minutes. It was, in its own bleak way, an appropriate ending for a man whose entire wartime career had been defined by spectacular futility. John Amery was born in 1912 into one of the most prominent political families in Britain. His father, Leopold Amery, served as Secretary of State for India in Winston Churchill's wartime government, one of the most trusted figures in the cabinet. John, by contrast, had spent the interwar years accumulating debts, failed business ventures, and a criminal record across multiple European countries. When the war began, he was in France. Rather than return to Britain, Amery made his way to Germany, where Nazi officials recognized the propaganda value of a man with his surname. From 1942, he broadcast on German radio, calling on British listeners to abandon the war effort and join Germany in the fight against communism. He also traveled to POW camps across Europe, attempting to recruit British prisoners into a Waffen-SS unit called the British Free Corps. He managed to sign up fewer than 30 men willing to actually fight. The fanatical conviction that drove Amery was a species of ideological delusion rather than cynical self-interest. He appears to have genuinely believed that Britain had chosen the wrong enemy, that the Soviet Union was the true threat, and that fighting alongside Germany was a form of patriotism. This argument required ignoring the Blitz, the Holocaust, and the entire visible record of Nazi Germany. But Amery managed it without apparent difficulty. He was captured in northern Italy in April 1945, tried, and hanged at Wandsworth Prison on December 19, 1945, by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner. His father never spoke publicly about the execution. What do you say about a man so comprehensively useless to his chosen masters that his treason barely registered as an inconvenience to the country he was trying to destroy? Number 6. William Joyce. Every evening from September 1939, millions of British families gathered around their wireless sets and heard a sneering nasal voice cut through the static with the words, "Germany calling, Germany calling." They called him Lord Haw Haw, and at the peak of his reach, an estimated 6 million British listeners tuned in each night, making him the most listened to enemy broadcaster in the history of British warfare. William Joyce was born in 1906 in Brooklyn, New York, a fact that would eventually become the pivot point of one of the most consequential treason trials of the 20th century. He had grown up in Ireland and Britain, joined Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists in the 1930s, and fled to Germany just days before Britain declared war in September 1939. Within weeks, he was broadcasting propaganda on Radio Hamburg. His broadcasts were a calculated mixture of demoralizing rumor, genuine intelligence, and outright fabrication. On occasion, his information about British military setbacks was eerily accurate, feeding a persistent wartime belief that he had access to inside sources. More often, he simply lied. But even the lies were effective. Mass observation surveys conducted during the war found that British listeners were both contemptuous of him and oddly compelled, tuning in to mock him and finding the mockery harder to sustain than expected. The legal question at his trial was whether an American-born man could be convicted of betraying Britain. The answer, delivered at the Old Bailey in September 1945, was yes, because Joyce had held a British passport and had therefore claimed the protection of the crown. The court ruled he owed allegiance to it. Nationality was no defense. He was convicted and sentenced to death. His final broadcast was delivered on April 30th, 1945, reportedly while drunk, the same day Adolf Hitler shot himself in the Führer bunker in Berlin. Joyce was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on January 3rd, 1946, the last person executed for treason in the United Kingdom. Lord Haw Haw got the ending his voice always deserved. Number 5. Wang Jingwei. In December 1938, the man who had once been Sun Yat-sen's most trusted political heir slipped out of Chongqing, the wartime capital of Free China, and began secret negotiations with Imperial Japan. His name was Wang Jingwei, and on March 30th, 1940, he sat in Nanjing, in a city already occupied by the force that had massacred its population 3 years earlier, and signed the documents that made him head of a collaborationist government. Wang Jingwei was not an obscure figure making a desperate gamble. He had been president of the Chinese nationalist government, a senior leader of the Kuomintang Party for decades, and a figure with genuine popular standing. He had survived an assassination attempt in 1935. He had been considered a possible successor to Chiang Kai-shek. When he chose collaboration, he did so from a position of real political consequence. His justification was what he called the peace movement. China was suffering catastrophically under Japanese assault. Wang argued that a negotiated settlement would save more lives than continued resistance. The logic had a certain cynical coherence if you were willing to ignore what Japanese occupation actually looked like on the ground, which Wang Jingwei appeared determined to do. His reorganized national government in Nanjing nominally administered territories containing approximately 200 million people. In practice, the government was a puppet in the most complete sense. Every significant decision required Japanese approval. Japanese military commanders overrode Wang's officials at will. The political program he had imagined, a negotiated peace that preserved Chinese sovereignty, existed only in his own increasingly desperate rhetoric. He was not a partner in governance. He was a useful face on an occupation that had no interest in his opinions. Wang Jingwei died in October 1944 in a Japanese hospital in Nagoya from complications following the 1935 assassination attempt spared the war crimes trials that followed Japan's defeat. He called himself a peacemaker. His countrymen called him a traitor, and his name in Chinese became as synonymous with betrayal as any word in the language. Does the sincerity of a delusion make the collaboration any smaller? Number 4. Andrei Vlasov. In July 1942, German soldiers pulled a Soviet general from a swamp in the Leningrad region. He had been hiding for weeks, his army destroyed around him, abandoned by the high command that had sent him there. His name was Andrei Vlasov. By the time they dragged him out of the mud, he had already decided to switch sides. The bitter irony of Vlasov's case is that he was, by any objective measure, one of the Red Army's most capable commanders. He had led the 20th Army in the defense of Moscow in December 1941, and military historians credit his performance there with helping save the Soviet capital from capture. Stalin rewarded him with another command, the Second Shock Army, tasked with breaking the German siege of Leningrad. When the army was encircled at Volkhov in the spring of 1942, Stalin refused to authorize a breakout. The army was destroyed. Vlasov was captured on June 12, 1942. His response to captivity was to agree to lead the Russian Liberation Army, known by its German initials as the ROA, a force built from Soviet prisoners of war who shared his loathing of Stalin's regime. At its core strength, the ROA numbered approximately 50,000 men, with a broader network of associated Eastern European volunteer units that some estimates place considerably higher. Vlasov presented himself not as a traitor, but as the leader of an anti-communist revolution, fighting a political system rather than his own people. The Germans were not interested in his political program. They used ROA recruits as they used every other resource available to them, as expendable manpower to plug gaps on a collapsing front. Vlasov's grand vision of a liberated Russia was never taken seriously in Berlin. What made his collaboration operationally catastrophic for himself was that the ideology he was sold was always a fiction the Nazis had no intention of honoring. In May 1945, in one of the war's strangest final chapters, units of the ROA turned against their German commanders and helped Czech resistance fighters liberate Prague from the SS. Vlasov was captured by Soviet forces on May 12, 1945. He was tried for treason in Moscow and hanged on August 1, 1946, along with 11 other ROA commanders. He helped save Moscow. He helped liberate Prague. History has never quite decided what Andrei Vlasov was, and that unresolved ambiguity is the most honest verdict available. Number 3. Pierre Laval. On the morning of October 15, 1945, French prison doctors were called to a cell at Fresnes Prison outside Paris, where a former head of government had swallowed cyanide pills he had hidden in the lining of his clothing. They pumped his stomach, revived him, and within 2 hours had him standing in a prison courtyard. A French firing squad then completed what he had attempted to begin. Pierre Laval had been, before the war, a mainstream figure of the French Third Republic, serving twice as prime minister in the 1930s. He was a lawyer by training, a negotiator by temperament, and a man who genuinely believed that political skill could extract advantage from almost any situation. When France fell in June 1940 and Marshal Pétain established the Vichy government, Laval saw not catastrophe, but possibility. He became the operational architect of French collaboration. In June 1942, he broadcast publicly on French radio and stated, without ambiguity, "I wish for the victory of Germany." This was not a diplomatic formulation or a statement extracted under duress. He said it, and he meant it, because he had concluded that Germany would win, and that France's future lay in positioning itself as a willing partner in the new European order. The calculation was cynical, grandiose, and wrong. The concrete consequences of his policies were documented in meticulous detail at his trial and in the decades of historical research that followed. Under his authority, as Prime Minister of Vichy France from April 1942, approximately 76,000 Jews were deported from France to Nazi death camps, transported on French trains, rounded up by French police. He also created the Service du Travail Obligatoire in 1943, a forced labor program that sent approximately 650,000 French workers to Germany. These were not policies imposed on him. They were policies he organized. At his trial, Laval argued that collaboration had been a shield, that by cooperating, he had moderated German demands and protected the French people. The 76,000 deportees were the answer to that argument. The cyanide he swallowed on the morning of his execution had been concealed in his clothing for months, a final act of control from a man who had spent the war believing he could always find an angle. French doctors removed it from him so that a French firing squad could finish the work. There is a particular, precise kind of justice in that. Number 2. Subhas Chandra Bose. In January 1941, one of India's most celebrated independence leaders crawled out a window of his Calcutta home, where he was under house arrest, disguised himself as a Pathan Muslim insurance agent named Mohammad Ziauddin, and began one of the most extraordinary journeys of the entire war, traveling through Afghanistan, across the Soviet Union, and into the arms of Nazi Germany. Subhas Chandra Bose had been, before this escape, a towering figure of Indian nationalism. He had served as president of the Indian National Congress, not once, but twice, in 1938 and 1939, before resigning after a fundamental strategic disagreement with Mahatma Gandhi. Where Gandhi advocated nonviolent resistance, Bose believed that Britain would only leave India if forced out by a combination of internal pressure and external military threat. He needed allies. He was not selective about where he found them. In Berlin, where he arrived in April 1941, Bose met Hitler in May of that year and received a distinctly lukewarm response. Hitler had little strategic interest in Indian independence and told Bose as much. Bose nonetheless formed the Free India Legion from Indian prisoners of war held in Germany, eventually recruiting approximately 3,000 men. When it became clear that Germany could not deliver what he needed, he undertook a 90-day submarine voyage from Germany to Japanese-controlled waters in early 1943, one of the longest such journeys of the war, to continue his campaign from the other side of the world. In Singapore, he took command of the Indian National Army, already formed from Indian prisoners captured after the fall of Singapore in 1942, and built it into a force of approximately 45,000 fighters. He called himself Netaji, respected leader, and declared a provisional government of Free India. In 1944, the INA fought alongside Japanese forces in the Imphal Kohima campaign, an attempted invasion of India from Burma that ended in one of Japan's worst military defeats of the entire war. INA casualties were devastating, running to tens of thousands dead, missing, and captured. Bose died on August 18, 1945, officially from burns sustained in a plane crash in Taipei, though the circumstances have been disputed by multiple Indian government commissions and debated ever since. He remains one of the most genuinely contested figures in modern history. Millions of Indians have never considered him a traitor at all. Airports, universities, and streets bear his name. Whether fighting alongside Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany to end British colonial rule made him a traitor or a revolutionary has depended for 80 years entirely on which flag you were standing under. That question has never been settled, and the man who left it unanswered is the reason he stands just below the undisputed king of this list. Number 1. Vidkun Quisling. On the morning of April 9, 1940, as German warships were still moving through Oslo Fjord, and Norwegian soldiers were still fighting and dying on the shore to stop them, a Norwegian politician walked into a radio station and broadcast an announcement to the nation. He had not been asked to do this by the Germans. He had not been authorized by anyone. He simply declared himself the new head of the Norwegian government and ordered all military resistance to cease immediately. Vidkun Quisling was born in 1887 in Fyresdal, Telemark, and had served as a competent military officer and briefly as Minister of Defense in the early 1930s before founding National Samling, the National Unity Party, in 1933. The party was Norwegian fascism, explicitly modeled on the Nazi movement, and it had been a political failure by any measure. In the 1936 Norwegian parliamentary elections, National Samling received less than 2% of the vote. Quisling was a man with a grandiose vision of himself as his nation's savior, and no democratic means of achieving it. His self-proclaimed coup on April 9th was so chaotic and unauthorized that it created active confusion within the Norwegian military command at precisely the moment when organized resistance might have mattered most. The Germans had not planned for it. It served neither side effectively. German Reich Commissar Josef Terboven was installed as the actual governing authority in Norway, making Quisling largely irrelevant from the beginning. He was finally installed as minister-president in February 1942, a puppet title with minimal real power, governing at the pleasure of occupiers who regarded him with a mixture of utility and contempt. Under his administration, the Norwegian state participated in the deportation of Norwegian Jews. On November 26, 1942, 773 Norwegian Jews were loaded onto the SS Gotland and deported to Auschwitz. Fewer than 40 of them survived. Norwegian police carried out the arrests under the authority of Quisling's government. These were his countrymen, and his administration handed them to their deaths. He was arrested on May 9, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender, tried in Oslo through August and September of that year, and convicted of treason, murder, and theft. He was executed by firing squad at Akershus Fortress in Oslo at 2:40 in the morning on October 24, 1945. 15 men pulled their triggers in the darkness of a Norwegian autumn. It was over in seconds. What happened next was the thing that makes Vidkun Quisling different from every other traitor on this list, and from nearly every traitor in the history of modern warfare. His name entered the English language as a common noun. The Oxford English Dictionary defines Quisling as a traitor who collaborates with an enemy force occupying their country. Winston Churchill had used the term in broadcasts as early as 1945. The Norwegian press had begun using it within days of his April 9th broadcast. By the time the war ended, it had traveled into dozens of languages. It is still used today by people who have never heard of National Samling, who could not name the German invasion of Norway, who have no idea a man behind the word ever existed. Most traitors are remembered by historians. Vidkun Quisling is remembered by dictionaries. He wanted to rule Norway. He got a word. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.